Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Scott DeVee, your moderator from Infoblox for today's session. Before we get too far into our content, just a few words on how to use the Zoom webinar platform. We're all used to Zoom meetings by now. My family has its Thanksgiving experience already scheduled next week using Zoom. Zoom meetings, while they have some similarities to webinars, there are just a few differences you want to note in the webinar platform. First, the Zoom window opens full screen by default. To exit full screen, press the escape button on your keyboard or select the view options menu at the top and click exit full screen. You can then resize the presentation window along with others like the Q&A window. If you have a question, as we go through the presentation, please ask them using the Q&A window. To open the Q&A window, click the Q&A icon in the Zoom toolbar at the top or bottom of your screen. Type a question into the text field and click send. All participants can see all questions as they come in. If you see a question you like or one that you'd like answered as well, you can upvote them or add a comment. We'll be answering some of the questions that come up as we go, and we'll take a few of the questions to the presenters at the end of the program. If there are questions that we don't answer immediately in this session, we will provide an email response shortly after we wrap up the webinar. If you'd like to ask the panel a question using audio, you can use the raise hand button to let us know. I'll check in with you to make sure you didn't click the button by accident, and then we'll get your answer to the panel. Sound okay? Great. I'd now like to pass the mic over to Chris Hindi from Empowered Networks to get our session underway. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Scott. Welcome to our webinar, The Value of Integration, Making Good Data Great, co-presented by Infoblox and Empowered Networks. I'm Chris Hindi, Vice President of Product Strategy and Innovation at Empowered, your host for today's program, and I'm excited to see all of you good folks who've turned out to hear what we have to say. We have more than 150 people representing the financial, manufacturing, transportation, higher education, and government sectors across North and Latin America registered to join us today. I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsor Infoblox for their help and partnership in preparing this webinar. We at Empowered Networks have had a long-standing partnership with Infoblox spanning more than 10 years, and we deeply appreciate the help and feedback they provide in getting this presentation in front of all of you. Over the next hour, you're going to hear us talk a lot about data in this presentation. And of course, data means a lot of things to a lot of different people. We're using the word in its broadest sense here, any sort of business, operational, security-related data that helps an enterprise focus their mission and deliverables to stakeholders. We're interested in your thoughts, so as Scott mentioned, please use the Q&A button in Zoom to share your questions and upvote those that your peers have asked as well. Here's our agenda for today's presentation. We'll start off by hearing from Kai Wang, who's going to share his observations about data at the heart of business. Kai has been on the front lines of the conversation about data-driven innovation in the enterprise for more than 30 years. Most recently, Kai was the CTO at SunTrust Banks based in Atlanta, where he and his team had conversations with the business units in the bank about how they wanted to provide innovative products and services for their customers based on the combination and integration of data. That data could be internally generated or provided by third parties, and it was Kai's mission to figure out how to provide that data securely and consistently to the business. Following Kai's presentation, we'll move on to our second speaker, Michael L., who's our VP of Services and Technical Engineering at Empowered Networks. Michael has been thinking about the data integration landscape for more than 20 years, both in an academic and strategic sense, but more importantly in a practical and customer-focused way as we help our customers sharpen their approaches to data integration. Michael will be sharing some thoughts we've been refining around new principles to data integration that I think you'll find interesting and enlightening. So let's head into our first presentation with Kai Wang. So often when you have this job of being the MC, you'll hear people talk about the next speaker as my friend. And in this case, I can say that honestly. Kai and I have been friends and colleagues for over the last 10 years. Kai's career in IT started as a printer technician, and now he's risen through the ranks over a course of a 30-year career to lead technology operations in some noteworthy companies. Kai has served in many roles, including in a chief of staff role to a CTO, As a VP and leader of a SaaS operations team where he needed to invent a whole new way of doing business for a traditional software company, as a transformation-focused VP in one of the world's leading financial companies, and ultimately as CTO at one of the biggest banks in the US. Incidentally, Kai and I met and bonded over our home technology stacks in a conversation about home video servers, and I can say honestly that he's a deeply clever and technical thinker. Without further ado or embarrassment then, it's my pleasure to introduce Kai Wang and his session, Data at the Heart.
Thank you, Chris, my friend. I really appreciate it. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to thank Empower and Infoblox for this opportunity to speak, everybody. What I plan to say here is my personal opinion, and I'd love to actually get feedback from all you guys as colleagues in the industry. As Chris said, a little bit about Kai, right? So I've been in the technology for the last 30 years now, started in 1990 in Sydney, Australia as a network technician. And my last assignment was the enterprise CTO for SunTrust Banks, which is now Truist. I'm a techie at heart, and today I'm sharing my point of view wearing my software development hat on, right? So here we go. First, I think we can all agree we're living very, very interesting time. 2020 has been a very challenging year for all of us. The coronavirus lockdown and subsequent work from home for many of us, the challenged state of economy and very high unemployment rate, strings of natural disasters impacting people's life and potentially, very polarized political landscape. But this, at the same time, it also offered a great opportunity for people who work in technology industry. The pandemic work from home is a good wake-up call for business on the importance of technology. And once we're out of pandemic, it should be a very exciting time for all of us. So how do we as technology leaders drive those next steps to leverage all the exciting technologies out there to enable our business to build that competitive edge? And how do we drive that big buzzword, transformation? Next slide. Thank you. As IT leaders, I think we all get bombarded daily by lots of these shiny new toys, right? But big buzzwords, agile, cloud, DevSecOps, APIs, big data, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. You're led to believe unless you do all of them, your transformation is going to be a failure. True. We must drive progress, right? So, we have to keep up with the market and changes. We must attract and retain our talents. But, we also know by implementing technology alone will not solve our problem. As a matter of fact, by adding more technology into the mix without improving the basic people, process, and technology, will make this matter way worse by adding more into that complexity, right? So I believe, we must drive the culture change as part of transformation and improve our organizational change management capabilities, encouraging our teams, to collaborate more effectively and sharing our information and data quickly and safely. So let's talk about data. In my humble opinion, you peel the onion of enterprise technology, layer by layer, you end up really staring two fundamental building blocks. One is data, one is business logic, right? So everything else is just built around them to service them, to provide, to consume, and to transform them. So if we can't process them within the SOA deemed necessary by our business, without the right data quality control and governance, IT itself will mean very, very little. I had, as Chris said, I had many different roles within my career, right? So all these roles are really dealing with data in one form or the other. And frankly, the challenge is not really getting any easier. They just become different. In my CA days as a software as a service leader, it was about who the customer is, what instance they have, what type of data, mass or mass data or production data, et cetera, right? So, and in Amex, it was about different type of client data, client data itself, the transactions, the balances, the merchant information, and all the associated, risk data with them. And then in SunTrust, it was all that, but at the same time, this constant interaction with the third parties, Fiserv, the like of Conduent, et cetera, as well as the, third party aggregators such as Plaid and Mint. The data type can be very different, right? And the transmission methods changed over time and improved. But in the core, matching that right data provider with the right consumer and with the right data quality and SOA, that challenge never really changed. So, as an outsider not into this day to day, one might think, you gotta be kidding me, right? I mean, you guys are smart, you're technology people, you don't know that? Well, unfortunately, it's easier said than done. Back in the 1980s, it was simple. It was relatively simple, right? So at that time, all the data, or most of the data really resides on the mainframe. But now data can be everywhere. New applications, new infrastructures popping up every day with new techniques like, data caching, et cetera, right? So it can become mind-boggling. Data is literally everywhere. Let me share an example of what I mean, right? So once I was in a very progressive enterprise company IT executive meetings and talking about a new business program, they want to launch. Somebody innocently asked a question, what is the right client demographics data we should be using? And somebody just said, come on, you don't know that? How can that be? But what's interesting is after some very heated debate back and forth, people realized that, whether it's your general ledger data or accounts receivable data, your partnership data, the servicing data, et cetera, they can be all very, very different, even though you're looking at the same client, right? So that's kind of an interesting eye opener. But at the same time, despite data is everywhere, to access them, it's not that simple either. We have, I'm pretty sure you guys all agree, right? We have generations of technology within our different type of data centers, whether it's mainframe, whether it's your CICS gateways, your various type of messaging queues, or the different enterprise services bus, implemented over the years, right? Adding on all the new APIs, data lake, et cetera. Very similar to the data concern. To find the right access to that data is not that simple either. I think a lot of times, typically enterprise companies use the middleware team as that pass, right? But unfortunately, a lot of times the middleware team, they are underinvested as well and underappreciated. They have lots of tribal knowledges, but unfortunately, these teams tend to be the middle of every single major application or infrastructure changes. So to illustrate, let me share another example, if I may, right? So this year in April, our government sent out the $1,200, the stimulus checks. While it was pretty amazing to see the government act fairly quickly, but in my humble opinion, the coordination with banks and financial services companies is less than stellar. Overnight, tens of millions of deposits came in from the feds, right? So, and then, in the morning, the clients wake up and then start checking, the web or the mobile over and over again. Where's my money? Everybody wants to get hold of their money, right? So, and that just unfortunately just generated traffic volume we never ever seen before. To make it fairly vague, typical large banks can handle about 4 times their daily traffic without much of an issue. But on that particular day, one by one, the banks start experiencing slowdowns and some of them outages, right? So it was a big challenging day. And one of the issues, we had many issues, but one of the issues we were trying to solve that particular day was around deposits. As you might know, deposits itself need to be checked against fraud and money laundering systems, etc. Right? So it's a BAU process. But on that particular day, a BAU process is now dealing with a tsunami of deposits and subsequent withdrawals. And unfortunately, that just drove our system to the very edge. We were trying to identify on the fly on those massive technical bridges, right? So, really we want to turn off this particular process, this checking process, against deposits, but only against deposits from our feds, and leave the regular deposits alone. Everybody just wished we can have an easier way to do this on the fly, but unfortunately we don't. So looking back, it was kind of very interesting, a failure case, use case to a degree, right? As Chris might call as a failure of imagination. So everything was working as designed, right? So all these processes are necessary as part of the BAU process. But nobody really imagined a BAU process can turn around and start impacting your business goals under a different condition. And there's a need for this, if I call that as an integration circuit breaker to deal with these fringe use cases on demand. But unfortunately, we don't. So let me bring this back up, right? So there's many ways for us to look at our transformation journey, and when it comes over to data, etc. So for me, that there's I have some thoughts as in what are the things we should really think through and consider, right? So as I called out, data and business logic, they're just super critical over to our application transformation journey. So it's need to be in the heart, and then. We must know, what is the right data, providers, consumers, etc. Right? So how to access that data easily and safely, that's super, super important. We need to implement the right modern technology, to enable those access, right, and the consumption. We need to look at it, people, process, and technology concurrently, not just only one element, right? I mean, to me, that's super, super important. People, we have to, we must enable and empower our teams and making sure we don't play the net zero game. And, and lastly, DevOps, that should just become like breathing air, right? We must shift over to the left. But at the same time, we must laser focus on operational outcome. Think about what's going to come out on the right. So again, thank you for listening over to my thoughts. It's a very small world. I'd love to hear about your guys' learnings and your journey, your success story, and let's help each other to be more agile and innovative. My LinkedIn detail is up there. Like many of you guys, I'm getting bombarded daily by requests. So if you don't mind just mentioning we met on the Empowered webcast session, that would be great. Thank you. Chris, back over to you.
Thank you, Kai, for those thoughts. There's a lot to take away there. If I could, I've got a question I'd like to ask. Where do you think the biggest opportunity for innovation lies when working with data in the enterprise?
That's a very interesting question, Chris. Just again, random thoughts, right? So as I mentioned before, I mean, it's really just super exciting time for technologists, like us, right? So I think we're going to see a lot of huge improvements. Name one, database technologies, right? Both in SQL and non-SQL. The data analytics, machine learning, big data capabilities are amazing now, and they're going to get way, way better, very quickly. Our data logging and time series and streaming and transports, all these essential components, I think they're going to get a lot better as well. And then, I think there's a lot of you noticed the no code and low code trending out there. I think they're becoming more and more popular. Right. And then most importantly, I think cloud is just being a huge, great enabler. They're making everything faster, from your ideation all the way over to your production. So I think we're going to see, enterprise paying a lot more attention into the good old data governance, right? So the better and handle your data, the faster you can drive these innovation. And to me, is I think working with data in the right context, that's just super, super exciting.
Thanks again, Kai. Let's move on then to our second presentation. Michael L. is our VP of Engineering at Empowered Networks. Interestingly, he's actually a trained biologist who had to choose between beer yeast and Python in his early days. He chose the Python route and a technology path that's led him into technology operations in the telecom sector. Again, Michael and I have a weird serendipitous connection in that we unknowingly crossed paths when I was in the television business as a feed room operator, and he managed the television connection facility for Bell Canada. I guess we've been integrated in one way or another ever since. Michael has worked closely with some of our largest customers on the topic of data integration, and through those conversations has refined a different way of thinking about the problem. Here's Michael and his presentation, New Principles for Integration.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so the modern enterprise has a ton of systems that are focused on almost all aspects of IT in the larger business environment. And this is great, but it's a double-edged sword in that on one hand, you have access to an amazing depth of information. But as Kai called out, the data is literally everywhere. So even though it exists, getting at it can be a challenge. And this is important because virtually all business processes require access to different parts of this data in order to function. The activities associated with getting or affecting change on data that live in different systems is a key and often the key contributor to the length of time that it takes for a business process to successfully complete. This is actually one of the key insights that's associated with DevOps. This also means that the value of the data is not fixed, but rather it varies greatly based on how accessible that data is and how timely that accessibility is. Having solid authoritative information about the network, for instance, is good, but providing timely accessibility to this data to other parts of the business makes it even better. Integration is all about solving this problem. Now, to be clear, this isn't a new problem. It's been a challenge for almost as long as there's been data, and there's been a lot of different attempts to address the issue. One approach has been the middleware and its variants, where systems are attached to some sort of a central data bus that allows them to share data in a normalized format. At their core is an attempt to provide a pathway into data contained on various systems. At the other end of the spectrum is the idea of just taking all of the data from the systems that are producing it and replicating those in a central location. This is sort of the data lake approach. So once all the data is in one place, you can carry out analytics to provide insights that couldn't be captured from the isolated systems by themselves. Lately, the vendors of the systems producing the data have begun to recognize just how valuable that data is and started to leverage this by making the data available directly via APIs. And the proliferation of APIs that we see now is sort of a testament to the growing appetite for this sort of access. Of course, the technologies I've been talking about, particularly with respect to APIs, are not, as much as some vendors may want us to believe, integration. If I use a baking metaphor, in much the same way that flour and eggs, sugar, milk, and such form baking's basic components, and they're absolutely essential to the final product, they only become a cake when they're brought together with intent and the expertise of the baker. So too with the APIs and other technologies. It's only when these technologies are utilized with intent and a plan that they result in something that can be considered integration. So what does integration look like? Well, in most cases, it starts with the realization that a system in the environment acts as a primary source for a particular type of data. Now, I'm going to use Infoblox as an example here for a couple of reasons. First, we're a platinum Infoblox partner, and as such, we've had years of firsthand experience in integrating their solutions. But secondly, and far more important, is that Infoblox is a perfect example of an authoritative source for enterprise information, in this case, about the network. This data has a lot of value when accessed directly through Infoblox, but because it's so fundamental to the network, it's hugely valuable to almost any other part of the operational and security ecosystem that touches the network. which is to say all of them. And the value is not only in the individual data points that can be leveraged, but also from the total corpus of data as a whole that Infoblox contains. This information is captured in network addressing, IPs, subnets, and the like, including the DNS and DHCP associated with the naming and allocation of the addresses. This functionality is provided by Infoblox DDI. The NetMRI and Network Insight components use Discovery to understand the actual devices that are represented by these addresses. The two together provide authoritative IPAM, which is, as the name implies, an authoritative source for information about and management of network addressing for the enterprise. So you have this authoritative source of data, and it would make sense to have access to it from something like your CMDB. So someone puts together a script that uses API calls to pull data from various Infoblox components and insert them into the CMDB. Then security realizes, hey, it'd be useful to have similar data to populate our tooling. So they spin up a workflow, say in their SOAR, that grabs the data as needed. And the NOC may want to enrich some of the information they're receiving using data from the Infoblox system as well. And maybe, because Infoblox supports both on-prem and private and public cloud environments, the cloud folks want to pull some of the data as well. So now you have 4 point-to-point integrations in place, completing transactions against Infoblox on one end and various systems on the other. But we're really talking about even more tools because, as I mentioned earlier, pretty much anything that touches the network has some interest in the type of data that Infoblox contains. The thing that you need to remember, though, is that while integration is happening, all these various different integrations need to be maintained over time to ensure that they continue to do what they're supposed to do as the environment and the enterprise is evolving. In many cases, you may have local copies of data that are created, which, as Kai alluded to earlier, introduces a whole other set of issues. Even if each of the individual pathways can be maintained independently, because of their transactional nature, they can collectively lead to issues with the authoritative data source due to the constant querying of this extra workload. As mentioned earlier, one of the solutions that may be put against this problem is insertion of middleware or an intervening common data store. While this may relieve the workload on the authoritative system and provide a boost in capacity, it's still a central aggregation point, and so it's still susceptible to scale issues. Also, by being a copy of data from authoritative sources, there's always the question of whether the data is fresh and complete with all the metadata that was available at the authoritative source. You also need to consider that each one of the various tools are owned by different groups. By moving copies of the data into an intervening system, you start to impact data ownership and displace expertise that the owners of the authoritative systems have. At the end of the day, you've created net new workload that consumes resources, time, and money, and that can ultimately offset the value of the integration it's supposed to provide. So if you think back to Kai's earlier comments, even with access to the variety of data management systems, authoritative data sources, and direct programmatic access via APIs, there's still problems that exist with shared data and effective integration. So why is that? Well, Empowered's been working in this integration space for a couple of decades now. I've been with the company for almost 20 years. And during that time, I've had an opportunity to work with a wide variety of different sized organizations. And we've run into these same challenges ourselves, where we created integrations that address technical problems, but somehow managed to fall short of truly solving the business issues they were intended to address. So over the last number of years, we've been thinking about the why behind it. And I'd like to propose a solution. We believe that integration is not a single monolithic concept, although it has been addressed this way to date. If you look at almost any large, complex integration problem, it's actually composed of two distinct integration concepts. Understanding these concepts and properly identifying where they fit into any given integration use case is critically important as they impact our ability to create effective integration implementations. The first concept is what we call transactional integration. Transactional integration is very much what it sounds like. It's the doing-centric type of integration that focuses on capture and execution of an individual workflow. So examples of this are things like provisioning a single server or handling a single change request. You may be doing tens or hundreds or even thousands of these at a time, but the focus of the integration is on the successful completion of these individual transactions. This extends to the validations and the controls that accompany them. So transactional integration is what, in our experience, almost all existing integration implementations are based on. In fact, there was a big industry push back in the early 2000s around this with the idea of runbook automation. So things like HPOO or Opalus or iConclude. And really, we've never moved beyond that approach. The second type of integration is what we call contextual integration. Contextual integration focuses on the larger picture concepts, such as the sharing of data across domains, and recognizing and acting upon organized populations of data, processes, or even transactions, rather than focusing only on the individual components. Examples of this include providing metadata to enable the scanning of entire networks, or putting a collection of transactions into a contextual construct that represents the larger business issue they're dealing with. Contextual integration allows us to address scale issues, data availability and ownership concerns, and exercise controls and analytics in a way that's just not possible at the transactional level. It's important to realize here that these two types of integration aren't just variants of one another, but actually represent fundamentally different concepts. I also want to point out that transactional and contextual integration patterns are not mutually exclusive. In fact, as we'll see later, they each fulfill specific roles in the overall integration execution that are complementary, not exclusive of one another. From an architectural point of view, these different types of integration can be seen in the following general patterns. Transactional integration patterns include offload, notify, and provision. Offload is where each individual datum is processed with the intent of moving it from one system to another. Think of moving a log entry from a source system to a SIM as it's created. Notify is another pattern that's concerned with reacting to specific triggers to drive additional activities. And we see this integration pattern a lot in the monitoring space. Provisioning, as applied to a distinct entity, is another common example. The steps involved are all part of a transactional focused workflow. The value statements for transactional integrations are really intuitive because generally they map directly onto the manual process, and it's easy to see how they can reduce errors, speed execution, and the like. But the same simplicity can mistakenly lead us to think that a similar direct mapping approach can be applied to big picture use cases. Unfortunately, the end result is often excessively complex and often fails to address the actual integration need. But as they say, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. From an implementation point of view, two of the common approaches to implementing transactional integrations include scripting and the use of automation tools. Scripts represent most organizations' first ventures into integration. They're usually single purpose, but they're also just scripts, so you can put them together quickly, and often that can be done in-house. On the flip side, the same simplicity creates issues with ongoing support and flexibility. And the single purpose approach also means that there are generally not very many value-added features. General automation tools like runbooks or SOARs make up the other major approach to implementation of the transactional integrations. They're well suited to these largely event-driven use cases as they are doing focused and target their integrity and validation checks on the individual transactions. But this transactional scope is also what makes it difficult to apply them to bigger picture contextual integration requirements. On the contextual integration side, example patterns include things like populate, synchronize, and audit. In all three of these examples, the use case centers around the context associated with collections or populations of information or processes, rather than being constrained to looking at specific transactions. As a result, you're able to ask questions about things like the rate at which transactions are completing or failing in the context of the population, or the composition of a collection of objects. This information is just not available at the individual transaction level. In the case of synchronization, it can also encompass the idea of moving data into the appearance of a local context for the system being integrated with. And we'll look at an example of this a bit later. Now, before we go any further, I just briefly want to talk about the fact that what contextual integration looks like and has impact on will vary significantly based on who you are. Different perspectives on an integration use case result in different value propositions, so it's important to understand which perspective you're looking at the problem from. Some of the perspectives that we'll use here as I'm talking through the examples include operations, security, architecture, and the executive view. Operations is responsible for and therefore interested in maintenance of systems at large scale, as well as full lifecycle provisioning for the components in those environments. When you look at security, their primary interest is in protecting the business as a whole, and that translates into completeness and timeliness. Completeness in that we've all heard the saying, it's not good enough to be 90% secure, and timeliness in the desire to be able to address any identified vulnerabilities before they become material issues. Architecture is concerned about some of the bigger picture questions, such as identifying and maintaining authoritative data sources, and the definition and standardization of enterprise functions. And finally, the executives are concerned about the financial implications of optimizing their investments and tools. But they're also the folks that sign their name and assume personal responsibility for the integrity of the enterprise. And as such, they're particularly concerned with contextual integration patterns like audit, as it pertains to compliance, ownership, and consistency. So now let's move on to some examples. So we'll start with the devices that make up an enterprise network. Operations are the folks tasked with ensuring that the network is up and running in an optimal fashion. Core to running a network is managing the devices that constitute that network and the addresses that are associated with them. Once again, I'm going to use Infoblox as the example here because, as I discussed earlier, it's the industry leader in IP address management and services delivery. Infoblox also utilizes discovery capabilities of NetMRI and Network Insight to enhance that with authoritative IPAM that confirms the data truly represents what's in the real world through interrogation of the actual network. Now, while Infoblox represents the authoritative source for information for IP address management, and it provides tools for the operations groups to enact changes, the requests for what changes the business require generally comes from another set of tools, the IT service management systems. As the requests regarding the configuration of the network come into the ITSM system, operations picks them up and implements them via the Infoblox tooling. This manual process can take a significant amount of time, and the need for manual transcription of data from one system to another can cause mistakes. As such, this is one of the places where we often see integrations created to increase velocity and quality while reducing risk of errors. And as discussed earlier, this is a very good use case for transactional integration, as these provisioning type workflows are well suited to this approach. Let's extend the use case a little bit and move to the security perspective. Well, Infoblox has a very strong story with respect to the operational side of things. They also provide some exceptional capabilities on the security side as a function of their threat defense offering. Because DNS is so core to the communication pathway between a user and the network, it provides a mechanism for visibility that can identify when users are attempting to locate the address of suspicious or known bad destinations. Then, via the Infoblox ecosystem, it's possible to create a transactional integration such that when a potential issue is identified, it kicks off additional activities, such as having a vulnerability scanner run a scan against the user's devices to identify an issue. But remember that security is concerned with completeness. So while the transactional interaction that I've described has immense value, the chances are that the vulnerability scanner wasn't purchased just to be used in these event-driven reactive workflows. The primary use case for a vulnerability scanner is scanning the entire environment, with the idea of proactively identifying potential vulnerabilities and kicking off activities to address them before they turn into actual incidents. But for this to happen, the vulnerability scanner needs to know the range of IPs and subnets that it should scan. As we've discussed a number of times already, Infoblox is the authoritative source for this type of information. The question is how to get it over to the vulnerability scanner. Often, the first step is to take a one-time snapshot of the information in Infoblox and move it, either manually or via a simple script, to the vulnerability scanner. While this is a starting point, the information is really more or less out of date the moment that it's transferred over. Recognizing this issue with data freshness, the transactional integration approach would then be to have the vulnerability scanner request the current list of IPs and subnets before each scan. But there's a couple of challenges with this. Since we're likely talking about thousands to tens or even hundreds of thousands of addresses, there are potential scale issues, but the larger issue is really that there's a tight coupling that's been formed now between the vulnerability scanner and Infoblox. And this dependency means that even things like transient communication failures between the vulnerability scanner and Infoblox can impact the ability of the scanner to do its primary job. And this is exactly where we see the difference between transactional and contextual integration. The contextual use case applies a contextual integration platform to provide a local view of the IP and subnet information to the vulnerability scanner that's continuously maintained, not just when the scan activity is initiated. This approach does several things. First, it allows the vulnerability scanner to utilize the data as if it were local, effectively making the data available directly in the context of the vulnerability scanner, while at the same time maintaining Infoblox ownership and authority. Secondly, it decouples management of the IP and subnet information from the device scanning workflow. This allows the vulnerability scanner to focus on its scanning activities without having to worry about maintaining data freshness or integration resiliency. This use of contextual integration is what we call the synchronized pattern. The same synchronization pattern will apply to any other external systems that are authoritative for data that could provide additional value to the vulnerability scans, such as a CMDB. Metadata for configuration items associated with the scanned endpoints that derives from the CMDB would be a good example of this. Now, in both cases, we've been able to provide the active system, the vulnerability scanner, with multiple views of data from associated authoritative systems that enhance its value and the ability to complete its tasks. But at the same time, we made sure that the authoritative sources maintain their control without impacting scaling by keeping all of this out of band of the high volume transactional scanning work that's occurring. Really, this is a win-win situation. Now let's have a look at things through the lens of the architect. As I mentioned earlier, this persona is interested with identifying and defining which systems are authoritative for which types of data and ensuring that they're treated as such. With this in mind, we can see how it would be important to have a contextual integration that can populate a system like a CMDB from an authoritative source such as NetMRI or Network Insight for a particular type of configuration item, in this case, network devices. This is a pattern that we refer to as the populate pattern. But the architect viewpoint is also concerned with the definition and standardization of enterprise functions. In this case, the contextual integrations themselves, such that all contextual integrations can be carried out in a common manner using a common platform that allows for consistent management, validation, and reporting capabilities. It's important to note that common delivery of the contextual integration capability does not mean funneling all activities through a single central hub, but rather maintains a distributed structure that avoids performance at scale issues that centralized models can incur. Now, finally, let's look at the executive perspective. As I discussed earlier, one of the executive interests is in ensuring that there's a good return on the tooling investment that they're making. So whether you're talking about full system integrations or reductions in data copy and storage and the associated administration with that, the ability of contextual integrations to make data from one system available to another in a way that it can be treated as local data increases the value of both systems significantly. But the executives are also the people that take on personal responsibility and, in some cases, the associated liability for the overall integrity of the systems. This introduces another contextual integration pattern, specifically audit, that isn't concerned so much with the individual data points as it is with the accuracy, consistency, and compliance of the overall data. Transactional integrations may be used to respond to individual changes in the data sets as they occur, but because they're scoped at the level of the individual transaction, they're insufficient to answer the higher level aggregate questions at the core of the audit pattern. Utilizing a contextual integration to provide oversight at the system level allows us to effectively provide audit functionality and address this important requirement of the executive persona. So I've walked through a number of examples intended to differentiate between transactional and contextual integration use cases. If I generalize this into a set of characteristics, we have the following. First and foremost, contextual integration is not a replacement for transactional integration. It's a complement, but it's one that's required for integration to be complete. They live side by side, each solving a different part of the problem. Specific characteristics of contextual integration include being data focused. This is done with an intent to provide views of data from authoritative systems to other systems, not by just making copies of the data, but rather by making the data available to the other system in a way that ensures it is current and correct without relinquishing ownership and authority of the source system. Contextual integration patterns are also not event-driven. They don't wait for something to happen before they act, but rather continually work to maintain a defined state or condition between the two systems being integrated. This continual work, rather than event-driven, also means that we avoid tight couplings of the endpoint systems. And this is a huge benefit in reducing fragility of the overall environment and helps minimize the impact caused by issues with performance or availability of the systems involved in the integration. Contextual integration also provides the ability to apply validation and controls at a higher level than just the individual transaction. When you're talking about something like synchronization, it's important to be able to evaluate things in terms of the entire population of data, rather than only on specific individual pieces of it. Finally, the contextual integrations are out of band of the event-driven transactional activities they support. This is a function both of their continuous nature and the fundamentally different system-level outcomes that they are intended to achieve. So I've talked a lot about integration and the distinction between transactional and contextual integration patterns. I'm sure we can all agree that, integration is good. Linking systems together increases velocity and quality and reduces opportunity for errors. Linking systems together is something that we can formulate using the transactional approach. But there's the rub. Linking systems together with transactional integrations is really just the happy path. It relies on underlying assumptions like my transactions will never miss or fail, and that no changes will occur to the systems outside of the integration. These are exceptions. But as Kai pointed out during his talk, in the real world, exceptions happen, and they're the places where processes go sideways. Transactional integration, by virtue of its scope and its intent, simply can't address all of these issues. In the bigger picture, syncing and auditing are every bit and perhaps even more important than just linking. And this is what contextual integration provides. In the end, it's down to the 80-20 rule. Our traditional transactional integrations may provide the 80%, but it's the 20% that they don't that's where you're likely to spend your time, your resources, and money. And that'll ultimately determine whether your integrations and the processes they support are successful. Contextual integration addresses the 20% of a transactional that a transactional approach cannot and will never be able to. In the end, contextual integration just makes your business better.
Thank you, Michael. So a little homework for folks to take away. Here's some food for thought on how you might start splitting your integrations into transactional and contextual. Start by assembling a short list of the major systems that you want to bring together, what data you're interested in combining, and which system should be considered authoritative for that data. We suggest that the system that is closest to the source and is most frequently updated is the logical candidate for authoritative status. Think about what other systems would benefit from the completed integration. Sharing is caring, as they say, and being able to share a clean, simple, and authority-driven integration with other users in the enterprise will help combat data duplication and authority conflicts. Next, evaluate the bottlenecks to sharing these resources. These are typically not technical in nature, but tend to be more political and social and possibly legal or regulatory in nature. And with all these facts gathered, then consider which pieces of work are simply point-to-point and which really require consideration at a higher level. Consider how many participants, how many systems, and how many facts you need to combine. As you find those more and more complex needs, these are your candidates for simplification by applying contextual integration. There's more to come from Empowered Networks on this topic. We're in the process of developing a context-driven data integration platform that we call Empowered Bridge. We're working right now with several large enterprise customers in a closed beta test to work out some of the approaches that Michael and Kai both talked about, and we'll have more to share on this product soon. We'd love to hear your thoughts and challenges too. Drop us a note at bridge@empowerednetworks.com or let us know in the survey that you have questions, and Michael and I will be happy to have a longer chat about putting context at the center of your data integration. Remember, context conquers complexity. If you'd like to keep updated on what we're doing with Empowered Bridge, please follow us on LinkedIn at Empowered-Networks. And with that, we have a moment for some questions, and there's a question in our Q&A window from William Burris. And William poses the question, what do I do if my data is always in flux? So Michael, Kai, I'd bring you back in here for your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, William, that is a really good question. And that's actually the challenge. One of the things that separates contextual from transactional integrations. Transactional by their nature assume that you are going to be able to complete a process, that you'll be able to start at A and end up at Z, and that will define a completed process. Contextual integrations recognize that particularly in large data situations, your data is likely to be in flux, and the chances of you being 100%, I'm 100% in sync may never actually occur because of how many changes are happening or the rate of change that's happening in the authoritative system. The challenge with a contextual integration platform is to provide mechanisms to allow you to get what is effectively synchronized. And that may not be 100% because of the flux, but you need to have visibility into how close you are to fully integrated and what that level of flux looks like, and have ways to statistically define that you are close enough that from an operational point of view, things are going to be fine. It's a little bit like what happened with the election. It's that concept of the counting up the votes leads to a certain outcome. And as they look back and do some of the recounts, they will identify certain ballots that may not be acceptable and will get tossed out. The question is, how many of those can you toss out and still have the outcome, which is the outcome of the election in this case, stay the same, or if it has to change? And contextual integration platform is about providing that visibility and understanding of the data as it flows back and forth.
William, I hope that answers your question. I'm also going to bring in a question that I answered earlier in the Q&A chat from Alexander Karstens. And Alex asks, are data lakes a key enabling technology to contextual integration?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this by prefacing it to say I don't want to throw shade on data lakes. Data lakes are amazing tools for answering questions, but the fact that a data lake pulls the data away from the source systems and deals with it as a copy in a separate environment really means that it's targeted at addressing historical questions and looking for things that have happened. It's very difficult to use a data lake to drive forward acting processes. So I wouldn't say that it's a key component, but I would say it's an important part of any organization will have use cases for it. The data lake doesn't represent contextual. Contextual integration platform is really about giving what I would call a view into the data, as opposed to creating a copy of it someplace that you can work on. Hopefully that answers the question. That's actually an interesting, both of these are very interesting questions, and I would encourage the people that asked or anybody else that wants to talk about this more deeply to reach out to myself or Chris, and we can have a conversation with you offline for sure.
That's all the questions we have in our queue. And that's just about all our time for today. I hope you found this session interesting and useful. We'll be making the recording of this presentation available shortly. So if you want to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, you'll have a link to the video in your email by Thursday morning. In the Zoom chat, you'll find a link to a survey that lets you tell us how we did today. Please take a few moments to share your thoughts. Every attendee who sends us feedback in the survey will be entered in the drawing for this Bose SoundLink Revolve Bluetooth speaker. I'd like to thank our special guest, Kai Wang, again. Kai, we really appreciate all the effort and time you've put into helping us get this presentation together today. Thanks for your friendship and for your help. Finally, I'd like to thank our friends at Infoblox once again for their sponsorship of this webinar. We appreciate your partnership on this session. Thanks to all of you who attended today. We look forward to talking with you more in the future.
Awesome job, and thanks, Chris. If you're joining us on YouTube, I'm going to be ending the stream in just a few seconds. And then we will be most likely ending this meeting at the top of the hour. So if you have those questions last minute, feel free to pop them into Q&A and our team will get to them. If you have other things on your plate today, we understand if you have to leave. So thanks for joining us. And again, if you have a question, pop it in and we'll get to it. And if not, then we'll make sure to stay safe and have a great day.